Welcome to the fourth in our series, our community lecture series on the topic, the ways of knowing. We've had, I think you'll agree with me, some wonderful experiences here and covered some important and some difficult ground in the past few weeks. Our previous presentations have led us through Job and his questioning of the God who was the figure, the person, the source from which he expected understanding and knowledge, through the mythological celebration of diversity and knowledge through story, on into the philosophical investigation of unity and the idea behind everything we see. Last week, we were involved in a man's untiring and dedicated search for multitudes of data, and his inspired and impressive analysis of all of that data, his conclusions formulated on the basis of the data, and possibly most interesting, his persuasive public presentation of his conclusions. And so there we finished with Mr. Darwin last week. This week's presentation by Professor Paul Spruell brings us to a quite different way of knowing, the scientific way of knowing. Paul Spruell got his PhD in zoology from Washington State University, here in the Pacific Northwest. He came to the University of Montana 11 years ago, and he's been teaching here in the Division of Biological Sciences and Wildlife Biology for the past 11 years. Paul tells me that this is the fourth year of his teaching in the Ways of Knowing program. His specialty, his research specialty, is preservation and conservation and management of trout and salmon populations. So it sounds as though he's right where he belongs in Montana. He did tell me that if he could make a decent living by floating the rivers every day, we'd never see him on campus. But I think that part's been tried before, and he clearly hasn't found a way to do that yet. Professor Spruell tells me that he is also an alumnus of that now famous Galapagos voyage, which was made with a group of Davidson Honors College students, Professor Sean O'Brien, John Glendenning, our presenter from last week, and also Paul just a few years ago. And he claims as really the high point thus far in his teaching career, the course which he taught with Sean O'Brien, I think in preparation for that voyage. Was that it? The course was called Islands as Ecological Theaters. And I can only imagine what it must have been like to be with Professors O'Brien and Glendenning and Spruell in the Galapagos Island. That would have been an experience not easily forgotten. I do have a couple of interesting tidbits about Professor Spruell. I know that he likes the blues. I know he does evening activities. I don't myself, but we have been in Chicago together, and he went out and I didn't. And I understand that he makes a mean pot of gumbo. But I've been sniffing the air tonight, and I haven't yet sniffed the gumbo, so I'm a little upset with that. But nonetheless, I give you Professor Paul Spruell to talk about science as a way of knowing.
Thanks, Linda. Is the mic working okay?
Yeah.
Good, thanks. So tonight, as Linda said, we're going to talk about science as a way of knowing. But before I go there, I wanted to step back just a little bit and talk just briefly about the class. And I know some of you probably haven't been to all the lectures, and I wanted to sort of put this talk in context. And so I want to start by just showing you our syllabus. You're getting snippets of the class. This is at least the syllabus Phil Fandozzi and I are using this semester. And I think Gary Hawk in his first lecture described our pace through material as a gallop. And I think that's pretty accurate. If you look at the material, you might also be asking yourself, how in the world a biology professor who works on salmon and trout conservation could possibly hope to teach this course, given black elk speaks and Buddhism, and I guarantee that thought crossed my mind, particularly the first year or two I chose to do it. And I wanted to answer that question for you, and I've got two answers. The first is this. These are my ways of knowing colleagues, and I really hope I didn't forget anybody. Sean O'Brien, Judith Johnson, Phil Fandozzi, Bob Pack, John Hunt, Ashby Kinch, Laurie Drake are not part of this series, although they very well could be. I've hidden the folks you've been exposed to down here on the right. And then I also included Jerry Fetz, Betsy Bach, and Jim McCusick, the current dean of DHC, as the folks who have really helped me. And one of the best things about teaching this course, and Linda and I were talking about it just before class, or just before this lecture, is the opportunity to interact with faculty members that I usually don't interact with. On campus, if you've been around, you know we've got the science side of campus, and then the other side of campus. And of course, we're the other side of campus if you happen to be on this side of campus. So the interaction's been really great, and learning from these fine folks has also been fun. The other part of the answer to how I teach this class is sort of a reminder of what our goal is. So we're really interested in epistemology. How do we as humans, know what we know? And so I think Phil Fandozzi is mostly responsible for the statement on bullet 2. We should think and be interested in why we read as much perhaps as what we read. And so context is important. So it's not that we ignore what's going on, but why is it that we're using Book of Job and these sorts of things to illustrate points? A couple of disclaimers, just in fairness and honesty in advertising here. We're talking about science tonight, but as a way of knowing instructor, and I think all the ways of knowing instructors always try to present whatever they're presenting in the best possible light. That's true whether I'm talking and leading discussion about Job or evolution or science, which I'm doing tonight. And so I'm not trying to convert anybody, I'm not trying to convince anybody their way of knowing is wrong. What I'm going to try to do tonight is explain or describe the process, the current process, that the scientific community uses to know what they know. The disclaimer number 2 is I'm not a philosopher of science. And so if you ask a philosopher or a historian of science to give this lecture, you'd get a really different lecture. You'd get a lecture that dealt with Francis Bacon and Popper and those sorts of things. Pardon? And that's not what you're going to get from me. You're going to get something about how the process actually goes on today as we know it, as we describe science. And my other comment is I'm fairly free-form and reasonably relaxed. So if anybody has a question or a comment, even if it's one that's humorous, just blurt it out loudly enough so I can enjoy it too. And that certainly goes for Dan and Ron and whoever else from the Ways of Knowing faculty is here. Okay. Linda gave you a little bit of a lead in. I want to take just a couple more seconds to remind you where we've been so you can sort of see how this fits into where we're going and what tonight's lecture is about. So we started the series the same way we start class. We started considering faith-based ways of knowing, and as Linda mentioned, Gary Hawk gave a really dynamite lecture using the Book of Job as an illustration of one faith-based way of knowing. We might also have used the story of Isaac and Abraham from the Bible, which we do in class. That's a slightly different take on ways of knowing faith. And so you can interpret it in a couple of ways, but if you interpret it the way Bob Dylan does, that way of knowing God is sort of a God who best not be messed with, lest you want to suffer the consequences. And so we play games with how do we know the divine and different takes on knowing the divine, and a couple of artists' renditions of that same story. You can see that the top one, which is by Caravaggio, is much darker, much more ominous and looming than the one below, and I'm sorry the artist escapes me on that one. Okay. With Ron Perrin's lecture, we moved from religious ways of knowing into more philosophical ways of knowing, considered Plato's cave, the notion that even though our senses may deceive us at times, we can reach some level of understanding of the world around us without invoking the gods. We move on in class to Descartes. The sort of crummy illustration down on the bottom, Descartes was really a founder in the fields of math and physics, using mathematics to explain the world around us. We moved on last week in John's talk to consider really the guy over on the left there, Charles Darwin, who used a huge series of observations to come up with this notion of evolution by natural selection. Alfred Wallace on the right came to basically the same conclusion. Never gets any press, so I thought I'd put him up here tonight. These two guys, I mean, they were really revolutionary, as John Glendinning pointed out last time, in the way we view the world, the way society views itself. But in terms of science, they sort of fall at a place that I would say was probably indicative of scientists as naturalists. So they accumulate a lot of observations, they synthesize those observations, but not really the sort of inquiry-based, hypothesis-driven process that I'm going to describe in just a few seconds. Okay. And so when I was asked to present this lecture, and I really appreciate being invited to participate, I was told to give you sort of an in-class experience, and I can tell you that if you were in my class, you couldn't just sit there and not participate a little bit. And so here we go. I think most people have some gut level reaction or gut level idea about what science is. And when I do this lecture as a plenary for the Ways of Knowing class, which is oddly enough going to happen tomorrow night, I always challenge the students to give me a one-word descriptor of science that differentiates science from the other ways of knowing we've considered, and just for example here, Job or Plato or Aristotle. What do you think? Observation, proof.
Skepticism.
Skepticism.
Predictable.
Predictable.
Reproducibility.
Reproducibility. You guys are doing great. You'd think there were some advanced degrees in the audience. Okay? So those are the sorts of things that I think we come up with, and I think it's sort of one of those things that most of us know at some level, but the real nuts and bolts of the process I think often gets escaped, or is escaped from us. And so science addresses different sorts of questions. There are things that are provable, things that describe how processes work. It also uses a different process. Okay. So I want to take just a few minutes and talk about the sorts of questions that science deals with, as opposed to the sorts of questions that really our early speakers dealt with, those that deal with faith and ways of knowing that are not based on empirical evidence. Okay. And really my purpose in putting this up is to sort of dispel the idea that science and religion, philosophy, or faith are really at loggerheads and cannot coexist, really. And not being a particularly religious person myself, I turned to a couple of people who I do know are fairly religiously savvy, and I started with Pope John Paul II. Okay. And this is from a speech he gave in '96. You don't need to read the whole thing, just the highlighted words give you the flavor. And so John Paul II says, sciences describe, measure life with increasing precision. Okay. But when we move to the spiritual, we're out of the realm of science. Okay. At the bottom, he says, anything that deals with self-reflection, aesthetics, our values, fall within the realm of philosophical analysis and reflection. Okay. Different sorts of questions approached in a different methodology, really going to two different ways of knowing. And I think this is a much more sort of honest and healthy approach than the other religious figure I drummed up. I don't know how many of you are fans of The Simpsons, but Ned Flanders is a very fundamentalist, devout neighbor of Homer and Marge Simpson. And this is a quote from Ned, and this, I think, illustrates the perception and the idea that I fear is almost more uniform or more accepted now. That's that idea that there's something scary and mean about science if you're a person of faith. It somehow challenges you. And so Ned says science is like a blabbermouth who ruins a movie by telling you how it ends. There are some things we don't want to know, important things. Okay. And so I'd like you not to use that sort of approach, but side with Pope John Paul on this one and accept that there are different ways of knowing, and those ways of knowing should be addressed to different sorts of questions. Okay. And just to drive that home a little bit more, let's look at a couple of examples. And so science tells us what may happen. Somebody said predictable in their description. And so here are a couple of examples. I know several of you at least are in the medical field. And so the first one, given some genetic testing that we can do nowadays, we can come up with a predictability. We can say that if a woman's carrying this specific genetic marker, she has an 86% probability of developing breast cancer before 45. It's a predictable outcome based on empirical evidence at hand. Okay? Or we could ask environmentally based questions. We could ask something about what would happen to the aquatic invertebrate community in the Blackfoot River if there was a cyanide spill. We can make some inferences about that because we can know, based on previous experiments, what level of toxicity different organisms would tolerate. So those sorts of questions we can answer scientifically. Other sorts of questions fall out of the scientific realm, and so should that woman with the genetic marker be told she has it? Should her sister, by nature of her having the sister, also be told? Should the insurance company be told? You're not so sure on that one. So these aren't questions in the realm of science. We can't do a test to ask the question. They're questions that fall into the ground of morals, philosophy, and reflection. Okay? Similarly, we make societal value judgments. Is it worth the risk of wiping out the aquatic invertebrate community in the Blackfoot to put a gold mine up there using cyanide heap leach? I can never say that. Cyanide heap leach mining. As a society, or as a state at least, we decided the answer was no. And we passed an initiative in the last few years outlawing that approach. Okay. So that gives you sort of a feel of where I'm going to go. And so science asks these why and how, or these how questions, not so good on the whys sometimes. And the process, as it's practiced today, is sort of very methodical, much like science itself. Okay? So what is science? How do we define it? You all had very good reactions, and we could really build the definition around the words you suggested. I'm going to go to the legal definition, and it starts this way. It's the study of the physical world and its manifestations, especially by using systematic observation and experiment. Okay. We'll get a little more specific, and the legal definitions come from Overton versus or Judge Overton in McLean versus the Arkansas Board of Education during a trial in which the state of Arkansas was suggesting that creationism be taught alongside evolution. It was struck down as being unconstitutional, and this is from that ruling with Judge William Overton defining science. So it's guided by natural law. It's explanatory by reference to natural law. It's testable and empirical. It's tentative. That came out in somebody's suggestion. Not necessarily the final word. And it's falsifiable. Okay. So it uses a different process. And I want to talk about that process from the sort of functional perspective of someone doing science today. What does it mean when the scientific community says, yes, we know this to be true? Okay. And I think probably in elementary school, probably for the first time, we started learning about the scientific method, and so you can just sort of, sing this along with me as I go. So you have some observation that leads to a question. You formulate a hypothesis to explain that observation and predict future observations. Again, that comes from one of your definitions. You go out and collect the data to evaluate the hypothesis. If the data don't support the hypothesis, remember, science is willing to accept the fact that they may be wrong. So you go back, you try a new hypothesis, and off you go again. If your data seem to support the hypothesis, you don't rest on your laurels and accept that what you've just tested is true, but rather you expand on that, you build on it. And that's another sort of theme of science, is it's always building, it's always looking forward, it's always trying to get a better understanding of what's going on. Okay. And I use this example a lot in class, and it's one of the world's great unknowns is how one knows a coin flip. Okay. And you can imagine that in a faith-based coin flip, I get out a coin, I get ready to flip it, and God says, it's going to be heads, Paul. I'm done, all right? Science doesn't work that way. We collect data, we flip the coin lots of times. You can see where this is going. You come up with some sort of mathematical confidence that what you observed matches your expectation that the coin is going to come up heads half the time. Okay? That's simple science. That's how science works. Okay? Math comes into science a lot, and so your conclusions are only valid if you can believe your results are only going to happen by chance 5% of the time or so. Okay? And so math, if you are following along, Plato was one of the first to start suggesting that the sort of road to truth went through math. Aristotle, Descartes certainly had that view. Math is sort of the ultimate test. Can we be mathematically certain that what we're seeing, what our conclusion is, isn't just due to some random chance? Okay. So that's all fairly straightforward. The process that I keep alluding to that the scientific community uses, I think many of you may know about because you've been through the process yourself, but it's one of peer review. And that's a little different than most other ways of knowing. And so I want to walk through how that works. And again, I know many of you are familiar with this. Entering freshmen, the freshmen in our class, usually are not unless their parents are academics. This is not something that sort of the standard person is used to. And so if I want my peers in the scientific community to believe they know what I believe I know, I have to do an experiment, and it should probably be a little more elegant than our coin flips. I need some compelling results. I have to write up a manuscript describing those results, including a description of the methods, and including the data, the raw data, so someone else can look at them and go, yeah, this is consistent. His analyses are correct. Okay. That manuscript then gets sent off to some peer-reviewed journal, and again, the peer review idea is other people who work in my field are going to read that manuscript and ask the question, is Spruell full of, or does this look good? Okay. So it gets assigned to an editor who assigns it to 3 or 4 reviewers. Those reviewers read the work, evaluate the work, consider whether or not it is worthy of acceptance as being true. In other words, is it something that perhaps is known? They then write comments and send them back to you, which is right up next to, I guess, comps, your final exam for PhD, among the more humbling experiences, because they're never good. Okay? That's just reality. This is probably one of the better ones I've seen. And this is a reviewer who says, yeah, well, overall the paper's okay, but there are at least 2 other explanations for the data that the author didn't deal with. Okay? Not that the author's explanations are incorrect, but remember the idea of tentative results, falsifiable, looking at all possible options, exploring all options. That's the hallmark of science. And so this review says, yeah, go ahead and publish it, but the authors need to consider these alternatives and discuss those in the manuscript. So if you get a review like this, it's a little humbling, but still it's not too bad. So you enjoy nightlife, go out and have a cold beverage, celebrate the fact that you've got a paper published, and move along. Reviews like this give you sort of a different feeling. The manuscript in current form is not suitable for publication. Okay. And it gets worse because essentially what the reviewer says is the researchers didn't really know what questions they were asking and didn't really answer the unknown questions very well anyhow. Okay. And so in this case, it's essentially a thank you for playing, please try again review. And when you get one of these, you get a little depressed and go out and have a cold drink and try it again, I guess. Okay. So assuming that you get the first sort of review rather than the second sort of review, so your work's been deemed to be at least sort of acceptable, the process goes on. And so the subject editor says, well, okay, here are the suggestions from your peers. You need to incorporate those, make the edits, send it back to me as the editor. I'm going to make sure you did those edits. I'm going to make sure you address the reviewer's comments. If that's satisfactory, then and only then will it be published in this journal, and at that point, perhaps accepted as true by the scientific community. But remember, science is always subject to further test and falsification. So now everybody else in the scientific community, in addition to the 3 people or 4 people who reviewed it last time, can weigh in and have further comment and criticism on the work you just did. And so this sort of leads to, I think, the hallmarks of science. This leads to that process. Science is progressive. And that's very unlike many of the faith-based ways of knowing. When is the last time somebody did a major alteration or addition to the New Testament? Not new translations. This is, well, we thought that Job thing was good, but now let's add a bunch of this stuff. Okay? It doesn't happen nearly so much. Science is all about taking what somebody did before you and adding to it, modifying and improving on it. Okay? There's this idea of it being iterative. Somebody said reproducible or repeatable. Science has to be repeatable. One observation isn't going to cut it. Okay? It's based on empirical evidence, something you can test mathematically. It's always subject to revision and falsification, and it's only accepted as even tentatively known once it's gone through this process and sort of passed muster in the eyes of the scientific community. Okay. Now, I want to give you an example, and this is one that I think many of you may have seen the first round, and I'm guessing fewer of you have seen the second round. And so this is a picture of what was dubbed, and I think it was 2 years ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, 2003 maybe, Homo florensis. And this was a fossil that was found, this little skull here, this one, was found on the island of Florena, I guess is the island. It was interpreted by the archaeologists who found it as being evidence for a new hominid lineage, and so a group of organisms related to us, really, but that were all dwarf. Okay? So an island on which all the human-like organisms were very dwarfed in stature. And this is kind of cool because on islands you often see animals either get really big, so think giant Galapagos tortoises. You also often see them get really small because of limited resources, and so there were these cute little elephants on the island of Java. This was at least presented as an example of dwarfism in humans on this island. Okay. So as I say, that was in 2003, I believe. Within the last 6 or 7 months, there have been at least 4 papers published where other researchers have taken exactly those same data, looked at the cranial features upon which those conclusions were based, and said, hey, wait a minute, we're not so sure we buy this. Okay. This skull looks like it's completely compatible with an explanation that is just due to a genetic abnormality known as microencephaly, small heads. And so, is it the case that this is a new dwarf hominin lineage, or is it the case that it's sort of a rare or reasonably rare abnormality expressed in an individual or two? We still don't know. And so the debate is raging, and in one of the more prominent journals just within the last couple of weeks, there was a summary of both sides, and the bottom line is we probably aren't going to know the answer to that question until additional bone fragments are found. That's part of the process of science. So the answer is still up in the air. How do we resolve it? We go get more data. So I've presented this process, and I think it's always important, and again, many of you in the room are probably experienced in this because you probably know a scientist or so. But I think sometimes there's the reaction that it's this process, it's very rational, we use reason, you know, kind of the, oh, what's the Star Trek guy, Dr. Spock, Mr. Spock? You know, everything's always logical. And that's not always the case. Science is done by humans, and humans are often not particularly rational, sometimes not objective, and that creeps into science. It creeps into science to scientists as individuals, and it creeps into science as a community. And I want to give you a couple of examples, one in sort of a good way, and then another in maybe a less flattering way. And so the idea of, is science always rational? Is it always, you know, just completely linearly logical? And the answer is no, and my best illustration of that is Barbara McClintock, who just died within the last 10 years. She was really a pioneer in many, many ways. She was a pioneer because she was probably the first woman geneticist to work in crop plants. So she worked a lot in maize, and she's holding what we would call, I think, Indian corn in her hand. So she worked a lot in maize, and what Barbara McClintock did, or at least what she got the Nobel Prize in '83 for, was described a genetic process, and this won't be on the quiz, so don't worry about it. She described a genetic process that allows little chunks of DNA to literally jump from one place in the genome to another spot in the genome. And so she called these jumping genes, they're now referred to usually as transposable elements or transposons. But her insight that this was what was happening came like many of her insights, and she was really a brilliant geneticist, but she describes the process, and the word she always used was integration, where essentially she'd look at a process, think about it for a while, and realize what the answer must be. And I'm not sure you can appreciate how radical the notion that little chunks of DNA just jump around our genomes was when she suggested it back in the late 60s and early 70s. So she would just realize what the answer must be. She'd then work backward from the result and come up with the way to rationally describe to her colleagues what must be going on and the experiments necessary to prove that she was correct. Okay. And so she really did the scientific process, but she worked it backward because she knew the answer based on some either subconscious sort of processing or on some really intuitive level, but very unlike the sort of logical progression that we usually think about. The other way that sort of our human biases and influences can come in is perhaps less flattering. Thomas Kuhn is sort of I guess a historian or philosopher of science, a bit of a critic of science really, and Kuhn suggests that really as scientists we're not so objective as we'd like to think we are. Rather, we start up sort of in the top there, just plodding along, collecting data, and more or less shoehorning our data into the prevailing notions of any given time. Okay. If we get data that don't fit what we think must be going on, we sort of dismiss those as some anomaly. We say, oh, well, the apparatus we used was wrong. We set it aside. We essentially ignore it or bury it. Kuhn claims that only when so many of those sorts of abnormalities accumulate do we start taking them serious, and he calls this a crisis. It's too problematic to just completely ignore. And then in Kuhn's world, we have a change in worldview. He probably, more than anybody else, is responsible for the notion of a paradigm shift. So we have a change in worldview. We have a new paradigm. Once that new paradigm becomes established, we sort of go back to doing normal science, collecting our data and putting it into whatever paradigm we're operating under now. And so that's a really different view than one where we collect data, interpret it objectively, and then reach some conclusion, even if it's counter to what we thought it was going to be initially. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but I think he's sort of taken it to the extreme. Okay. So, just a little progress check. Let's see what time. I'm doing good. And I usually, completely steer clear of controversy or anything like that. And so before I go on, I figured I should check and see if I've done anything too out of hand so far. Okay. So any gross misrepresentations or any doubters that science exists? I like phrasing it that way. Does anybody not believe in science? Okay. Yes?
There's a question that may be more semantic, but early in your delivery and then now you throw in the word belief. How do you differentiate belief from knowing?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. So if you didn't hear, the question was, how do you differentiate belief from knowing? And I'm using believe a couple of times, and actually I did it on purpose this time. What's the difference between belief and knowing? And I think maybe the best way to think about it is you can believe something to be true, but not know. And so I may believe that I'm going to get home and somebody's going to secretly have put some really good barbecue in my house because I didn't eat beforehand and I'm hungry. I may believe that, but I don't know it because I guarantee that's not happening. Okay? And so it's sort of a subtle difference, but I think that's the difference. You can believe something, but to know it is to think that it's definitely true. Okay?
Do you think the word dogma, as generally understood, has any place in science?
That's an interesting question. So does the word dogma have any place in science? And I teach genetics and evolution, and we use dogma. We use the central dogma, which is DNA codes for RNA, which codes for that sort of thing.
So you do lay down a baseline.
Yeah, and I think that baseline is important. Those are the things that sort of we are fairly certain are true. And I think when we deal with things, and I wouldn't call them dogma, but when we deal in genetics with things like Mendel's first and second laws that describe how genes are passed from one generation to the next, I wouldn't call that dogma, but those are certainly things that have been tested repeatedly that we believe to be true. The more we understand them, the more often we find out that, well, there are little tweaks and little things that are derivatives of that or slight modifications of it, but in terms of something that serves as the basis for the field, that's certainly one.
Yes, one quick follow-up.
Sure.
Do you use the term laws anymore?
Occasionally, yeah. So we do talk about Mendel's first and second laws of inheritance. And we also talk about how those laws can be broken. And so I think in terms of are they a law, they're a law because they form, and like I said before, I think it's when they form the basis of an entire field, and Mendelian genetics forms the entire basis of transmission genetics. That's when we start thinking about things as a law, but not as a, this is never going to be broken, but more as the reference point back to which we compare everything. So since I've got you all believing in science, I'll pose a couple of questions, and as I say, I don't like to go anywhere controversial. And I sort of joke about this a little bit, but it's something I take fairly seriously, and it's something that in some ways confuses me a little bit, because there's a huge debate and there's a huge controversy, and I'm not sure where it's coming from. I have some ideas, but when you break it down to looking at the argument logically, I'm not really sure that there's much of a controversy at all. And so anybody who's from around here has dealt with this. In Darby, 2 or 3 years ago, we had a complete replacement of the school board because school board members decided to teach or offered to teach intelligent design as an alternative to Darwin's theory of evolution, which John described last time. Okay. And so we end up with this question of, should we add intelligent design classes discussion in science classes? And I think the crux of the question, and it's actually the way that the legal findings have gone every single time it's gone to court, it really comes down to, is intelligent design science? And we'll address that question in just a second. Again, because I like to steer clear of anything slightly controversial, I often pose this question to the students. And so right now, sort of the rallying cry of those proponents of intelligent design and teaching intelligent design in science class, their rallying cry is, teach the controversy. It's just an alternative view. Teach the controversy. What could the possible harm be in exposing students to various ways of thinking about things? So if you teach the controversy in my science class, I should be able to come teach the controversy in your Sunday school class. That logic often doesn't fly too well. Okay? So we'll skip that. Although I will tell you that the very first time I ever gave this lecture, Dan Spencer gave me what I thought was a dynamite answer to those two questions, and I may put him on the spot at the end since he's here. Okay? So let's go back and see how we can approach this question. So we've defined science, or I've defined science, a couple of different ways, legally, functionally, but let's go back to sort of the scientific method that we stepped through. And so remember, oh, sorry, forgot. I just wanted to mention the idea of intelligent design before we really pose the question, is it science, in case any of you have sort of missed it, which seems unlikely. The idea really goes back to Paley and his idea of a watchmaker. And so Paley offers the question, if you're wandering through a forest somewhere and you stumble across a pocket watch, and I think the analogy worked better for one of the old wind-up pocket watches with all sorts of gears and cogs. If you looked at that watch, wouldn't you assume by the nature of the watch itself that it must have been designed, and it must have been designed by an intelligent designer with a real purpose in mind. The purpose was to make a watch. Okay? And so that's that part. The intelligent design proponents have snagged that idea. They often use a mousetrap as their latest illustration. And so if you look at a mousetrap, wouldn't you assume that that was designed, because it's kind of a squirrely looking little thing, wouldn't you assume that that was designed to do something specific? All the parts work just so. It's designed to kill mice. If that logic holds for our pocket watch and our mousetrap, then doesn't it also hold that if we look at something like the human eye that is incredibly intricately designed to allow us to see, or the flagellum of a bacteria that's incredibly intricately designed to allow the bacteria to move. It's essentially a little cellular motor. Wouldn't you also assume that it was designed by some intelligent designer with a real purpose in mind? And so that's the crux of the intelligent design debate. And if anybody thinks I shortchanged them, this is a good time to yell at me. And so let's run this process through our sort of simplified test of what is science. And so we've got some observations that lead to a question, and in this case we're doing good. So we've observed that there are biological systems and processes that seem to be so complex and seem to be designed for a function. They seem to be designed so we can see. Would that not imply that there were an intelligent designer behind everything, causing the development of those tissues and organs to be just as they are? So our hypothesis then, to explain our observations, is that there's an intelligent designer, some supreme being, although the intelligent design advocates never exactly say who she is. There's an intelligent designer that's creating these wonderful complex systems in nature, and if we look in nature, we'll see more wonderful complex systems that must have also been designed. So we've got our hypothesis, we've got an explanation, and we've got a prediction. So now we need to go out and collect data to test the hypothesis. This becomes a problem. So at this point, I'm asking, or the scientists are asking, for data to prove the existence of God. Because that's where we're left. If you can only explain the existence of a beautifully designed eye because God designed it, how do you test that? There is no test. You also can't falsify it. I can no more prove to you there is no God using science than you can prove to me that there is. And so it's not really a question of is there a God or not, it's is this a scientific way of knowing? And it fails the test of science because it cannot be falsified. That's where the debate comes in. That's why I don't see how there is possibly a debate. It does not match science. It doesn't match the definition of science. Okay? And so I think this illustrates it fairly well. If you're explaining a scientific process and you get to step 2, it's not falsifiable. It just simply cannot be tested. Okay? So I'd argue that because it fails this test of falsifiability, intelligent design fails the test of being science, and it doesn't belong in a science class. Does that mean there is no intelligent designer? No. It simply means that it's outside the realm of science to test the existence of an intelligent designer or designers. Okay? It's not that science says faith is wrong, it's simply a different question and a different way of knowing. And so do I think intelligent design should never be taught at school and college? Apparently not, because I'm going to pose the same question to my class tomorrow night. It's just not something we talk about in my genetics and evolution class because it doesn't fit the definitions of a scientific way of knowing. Okay. So science is a way of knowing how the natural world functions. It's based on a series of theories, tests, revisions, statistical tests, peer review. It does actually fairly poorly in asking why or should questions. Should we do this? Why did we do that? But it shouldn't, I don't think, be perceived as a threat to other ways of knowing, to faith-based ways of knowing. It shouldn't be a threat to those who have faith. It's simply a different way of knowing. So, I wrapped up a couple of minutes early. Be happy to do questions, and I'll just remind you again that there are some sheets of paper around if you've got questions for the panel in a couple of weeks, or you can email them to Ken. I think you'll take them as well. Questions or comments? Yeah?
You said, just out of curiosity, you said that you had an idea where this was coming from, the intelligent design, seeing science or evolution and intelligent design as in some kind of a conflict. And you said you had an idea. I'm just curious. What do you think is at the basis of this?
I think the basis, and anybody else who... Yeah, so the question was, I had made a comment early on that I had some sort of vague notion of where the perceived threat from the proponents of intelligent design came from, why they perceived science as a threat. And I think it comes from the fundamentalist Christian movement. And so intelligent designers are very careful never to use God, and particularly never to use Christian God in their explanation of who or what the intelligent designer is. But if you look at where funding for the movement's coming from, it's all coming from a place called the Discovery Institute in Seattle. You don't have to scratch very deeply to see that they're really all about the fundamentalist Christian point of view. And I think the other place that the sort of threat, the perceived threat comes from is the notion that if we believe in evolution, and again, I think it's sort of a false dichotomy because they immediately couple evolution as being equivalent to science. Evolution is one component of science, but it's not, the scientific way of knowing is not defined by evolution. But I think they believe if you believe in evolution, therefore you must not believe in God, and therefore science is a threat to their way of knowing, which is completely centered around a Christian God. I don't believe that that's a logical argument, but I do believe that's where it's coming from. And it's sort of, I said the conflict was a little confusing to me. I think if you ask most scientists, they don't see it as a conflict. They're certainly not out being evangelical about spreading the good science word and battering down the evil Christians. I don't know anybody who's doing that. So, but I think that's probably where it's coming from. Yeah.
May I just bring a microphone down here so we don't have to. There you go.
I do think that perhaps one thing that does happen in schools is that science isn't always presented as a way of knowing, it's presented as the way of knowing. And that if science is laid out or evolution is laid out, this is the way it happened. And it's not, there isn't an option left on that side either, sometimes.
I believe that's true, and I think it's especially true in science classes. And evolution really does serve as the basis for most of the ways we believe we understand science. And so we present evolution as sort of the underpinnings because right now it's the best explanation we've got. And so I don't know that there's much to be gained by offering another way of knowing biology when it doesn't do anything. And so what are we going to do? We offer up there may be an intelligent designer. Well, there may be, but it doesn't do anything to forward our understanding in a scientific perspective. So, and that's why I think courses like this, and particularly courses like this for freshmen, are really important because it exposes them to all different ways of knowing and makes it very clear that they are different ways of knowing, addressing different issues. Yeah.
I've become more aware of a subgroup of scientists that are intelligent designers, and they've generally identified the flying spaghetti monster as the intelligent designer.
So if any of you have not visited the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster website, it's worth a visit. It was a website, it started when the school board in Kansas was also suggesting that intelligent design be taught alongside evolution as an alternative. And a physics graduate student in Oregon, clearly with too much time on his hands, created the myth of the flying spaghetti monster. And his point was that you can no more test the reality that all of creation was formed by this sort of nebulous mass of spaghetti with meatballs for eyes, reaching down with its noodly appendage to spark life into all existence. You can no more test that than you can test intelligent design or any other creation myth. And so it's done really tongue-in-cheek. And I actually used the flying spaghetti monster in class. Shouldn't say that with the dean here. But the flying spaghetti, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster offers up 8 "I'd really rather you didn't" that sort of correspond to the 10 Commandments. But it is a really interesting way to get students to start thinking about, because they read this business and think this is the most asinine, off-the-wall thing. But if you ask them how you test it, it comes back to the same answer where you can't test either of them.
You mentioned, after valid experiments are done and they're written up and they're presented in journals, et cetera, would you care to comment on the recent expose of governmental agencies that get in the middle of this, which the scientists have recently discussed?
So you're talking about some of the notions that the scientific findings related to global warming are being squashed, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's sort of an interesting one. And I think I would put that in the category of science not always being logical and reasonable or rational. And I think, I'm trying to, it seems like a horrible situation to be in to me. And being at a university, it's sort of the best possible world in terms of academic freedom, at least so far. And I can't imagine the situation where the science or scientists would purposely skew their data or alter it. I'm sure it definitely happens. My guess is more likely than not, it got buried bureaucratically. And so that's essentially society saying, well, okay, we know what the science says. We don't like that answer, and so we're going to bury it. I'm not sure I think it was a flaw with science. We have actually, within the last year, seen a real flaw in science. I don't know how many of you saw, there was a Korean researcher who claimed to have isolated stem cells, I think. I'm trying to remember. Turned out to be a complete fraud. It was published in Science or Nature, which is, the two largest journals. That sort of thing happens. The interesting part about it, from my perspective, was it came out in the end. People said, now wait a minute, we've got some questions here, and these answers they aren't satisfactory. And so essentially the guy's sort of feet were held to the fire, and he had to recant. But it was definitely a blemish. It was an embarrassment for science, and it was definitely an embarrassment for the journal that published the article.
A follow-up on that, a corollary to it, there clearly are instances of scientific fraud, like you just described, and would like you to distinguish those from your comments several times that scientific data are falsifiable, because you're using falsifiable in an entirely different way, and I wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a really good point. We use falsifiable to mean essentially that our results are tentative. And if we collect additional data that prove our initial explanations were wrong, or prove they should be modified in some way, we're willing to modify our conclusions. That's different than they're falsifiable in that you can sort of sham them some way or another. Yeah, that's an important point, and thanks for that.
Paul, over here.
Dan.
I pretty much agree with pretty much everything you've said, but I want to push a little bit further on your, I think, possibly too easy reconciliation between science and religion. And push you on one point, you had very helpfully up there that science is progressive in the way that it moves. But I also want to talk about, I think science is fundamentally destructive. That is, it advances by also ruling out and destroying earlier worldviews and perspectives. And that's where I think so oftentimes the tension with religion comes in, because it has very strong implications for, say, religious cosmologies or religious perspectives and things. And so religion progressively gets reduced into the realm of meaning and morality. But that's a very reduced sphere for what religions used to having province over. And so some of the tension between science and religion comes from advocates of religion who aren't comfortable with finding their worldview progressively reduced further and further into an area because of the implications of science. And so I agree that there are many different ways to have science and religion be compatible, but there are many forms of religion that are simply incompatible with science as it's emerging currently. And that's where you identify literalistic forms of religion that have a literal interpretation of Scripture and insist that that describes a cosmology that's out there. That's incompatible with our modern worlds of science.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and I think what you just described, the literalist interpretation, is the one scenario where I essentially can't offer up an alternative, because once you accept that the earth is 6,000 years old based on who begat whom in the Bible, or once you accept Genesis as a literal telling of creation, you've moved out of logical thought. You've accepted it on faith. You may well be right, but it's not a logical argument. And so having even the dialogue is often, I think, difficult. But the point you bring up about science sort of diminishing the role of God or the divine has actually been a criticism of the intelligent design movement by some of the intelligent design folks themselves, because the phrase becomes, you end up with a God of the gaps. And so only when science isn't sufficient to explain something do we invoke the intelligent designer. As science progresses, the amount we need to use that intelligent designer for goes smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the God of the gaps essentially starts decreasing in importance. Okay? You clearly don't agree.
How'd you guess? Where are my running shoes?
I'm not going to get more.
I'm not sure I'm going to phrase this, but to follow up just what you stated, I was glad. Thank you for doing an overview, by the way, at the beginning of the class for what this ways of knowing is. And I noticed in the syllabus that there was a subject of string theory. Mm-hmm. And in talking about the science diminishing faith-based knowledge, how does science justify astronomy, where there's no real testability? And certainly parts of string theory, no testability.
Yeah, really good question, and I'm glad you picked up on that. We watched a NOVA. I don't know how many of you have seen the Elegant Universe series with Brian Greene and NOVA, which is what we use to introduce string theory, and we watched that in class this morning. And I show it precisely for the reason you just brought up. String theory, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I can't imagine you're not, is an attempt by physicists to come up with a unifying theory of everything. A theory that will explain both the motion of large planetary bodies and explain motion at quantum levels, subatomic particles. Okay? Newtonian physics doesn't work very well at the low level, at the very tiny level. Quantum physics has some problems to describe large movement of large bodies. And so physicists are working on this unifying theory of everything. Sounds a lot like a religion. One of the issues, and the mathematics is incredible and well beyond my comprehension, but one of the issues with string theory is it cannot be tested. We currently don't have the technology to measure the insanely small particles that the theory predicts must exist. And so if you've seen that series, we watched the third one, and you have a whole series of mathematicians and physicists on screen saying things, and I'm not giving them any, I'm not exaggerating. They say things like, it's hard to conceive how math this beautiful and elegant could not be right. Sounds a lot like a faith-based way of knowing. At the end, they go so far, one of them who is pretty direct says, the real test is going to be, can we find evidence? Can we find empirical evidence? Until we do, this isn't science, it's philosophy. And so string theory is in the class exactly there for exactly that reason, to bring up that question, what is and isn't science? It's easy to pick on intelligent design. It's a little harder to go, well, string theory fails the test too, quite frankly. Now I'm in trouble.
Paul, I want to pick up on what Dan was saying about the shrinkage of religion and religious understanding in the face of the, quote, progress of science. And give you a chance to maybe respond again to Dan, using the distinction that you made between the why questions and the how questions. It seems to me that we are still dominated in our lives by why questions, not how questions. Why suffering? Why death? In fact, there's one how question that never gets answered, and that is, how did it all start, right? The Big Bang. And so it doesn't seem to me that if you use that distinction between how and why questions, that there should be any diminution in the realm and the region of religious explanation, or I like to use the term mythological explanation, in relation to scientific explanation, except for the fact that culturally we seem to be under the thrall of the scientific paradigm rather than the religious or mythological paradigm. You want to respond to any of that?
Actually, you said it well, much better than I could. I agree completely. I mean, I think that we are sort of dominated by the scientific umbrella, and as we move that way, we get away from sort of the more, and I like the term mythological ways of knowing. And so I agree with you completely. Like I said, you said it better than I can, which isn't surprising.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah, so we'll get it down here in just a second.
Thank you for a very well-organized lecture. I've enjoyed this. You talked about predictability as being a hallmark of science, and then in your Sunday school class, you ventured to be able to talk about chaos. Is there a part of science that acknowledges perfect unpredictability?
Yeah, and I think we definitely acknowledge that while things may be, how do I want to say this? So things are often predictable in the sense that we can offer up a probability that something may happen. We very rarely know what the outcome is going to be. And so it's predictable in the sense that we can make some guesses. We can say, well, okay, we'll flip the coin, and 50% of the time we expect it to be heads. But if we flip it 10 times, often we're going to get 6 and 4. And so it's predictable in that sense. It's very unpredictable in the sense of having an exact knowledge of what any outcome is going to be. There were questions down here, I think.
Thank you. Last week, I believe it was said that Darwin would have been very, very nervous if he thought that the Earth was perhaps younger than it is. And as the fact that we have much more evidence now as to the age of the Earth, don't we have a situation where the Earth really isn't old enough to produce a change from ape to man? Is that not a fact? Not a fact. Is that not something that is discussed among scientists today?
Yeah, it's definitely discussed. And so Darwin, when he described the process of evolution, really focuses on slow and gradual changes, accumulations that are sort of minuscule in their effects. What we're learning now, one, we've learned that the Earth is a bit older than we've thought. There's still the time issue you bring up. But what we're learning is that there are ways to get fairly dramatic changes in phenotype. Sorry, I'm going into genetic speak. Into the way we look, our physical expression, what we see and do. There are ways to get fairly major changes that don't require a lot of change at the DNA level. And so the example I usually use in class, if you just look around at the folks in this room, and with some trepidation, I'll go ahead and do it the way I do it in class, and imagine them all naked. Okay? The most obvious difference, if I asked you to sort people into 2 piles based on the way they look, you'd sort them that way based on their gender, right, and on their sex. How many genes do you think determine what sex we are? Right? The reason that single gene causes such a huge difference in our physical expression is because it gets turned on very early in our development, and essentially what it does is it says, make testosterone. Testosterone then influences the complete developmental path of the embryo to make some embryos male, some embryos female. Other example I'll give you is, I think you've probably all read or seen in the news, the notion that we share 98 or 99% of our DNA with chimps. So why is it that we're 99 or 98% chimp DNA, but we look and act reasonably unlike chimps? And part of the answer there is similar. We're learning that the regulatory genes are probably more important in the way organisms turn out, the way they develop and function, than the actual protein coding genes themselves. And so you can think of it as sort of the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain with all these switches that you can turn on and off at different times. The pattern in which they go on and off can make huge differences in phenotypic changes. So we can get fairly major changes in phenotypes with fairly minor, or what appear to be fairly minor, changes in the genetic code. So I think we probably have enough time to end up where, well, apparently we probably had enough time to end up where we're at. Yeah.
Paul, I haven't had a chance to think about this in so long, so it's so much fun to hear this again. So this is really an old question. Is it your understanding that research science is basically inductive and the application of science is deductive? And the follow-up question would be, is it a failure, if that is true, is it a failure in the inductive method that prompts, in the deductive method that prompts the inductive or the research to continue?
Good question. I have to think about that one for a second. I think in some cases it's probably a failure in the deductive method. In some cases, I think either can fail, I guess, is the short way to answer that. And so I think we can be wrong. I'm not answering this question very well.
Paul, can you remind us what inductive versus deductive?
Please.
Inductive and deductive. I'm struggling. It's like, oh, think on your feet. It's real.
Inductive would be going from a set of particulars to a generalization that then becomes a major premise in a deductive argument. So then move from major premise to minor premise to conclusion.
Okay, and so that's where I was sort of headed, was if we start with our, what was the first thing I had up there? We come up with some observation that causes us a question, and then we come to a hypothesis. If that's a miss, then I don't think it's a failure of the deductive part, if I'm following this right. It's really a failure for us inductively to come up with the right question.
But you've got to deliver it to practice. You've got to deliver it to the applied part of science, some kind of an assumption. All cats are gray.
Yeah, so you definitely deliver that, but it may or may not be true. And so if you fail there, if you're wrong at the beginning, then it's not necessarily a failure on the other end, on the deductive end. You didn't have a prayer because you didn't start in the right spot. Sorry, I don't think I'm answering it right. So.
You had a face up there, I think his name was Kuhn, who was describing a process, and it sounded like a pretty cynical one. He accused scientists of fitting the data into an idea they had. Unless it got ridiculous, they'd go back and start over again. What was his purpose? Was he being cynical about the scientific process?
And Ron, if you know more about Kuhn than I do, help me out here. My knowledge of Kuhn is that he was, in fact, a practitioner of science who sort of became more interested in the history and philosophy of science than doing it, and so started looking at progress and how we progress. And so I'm not sure whether he was purposely being cynical, whether he had some experience that caused him to question the entire process. I'm not sure sort of what his underlying motives were. Ron, do you know?
Well, I think he was trying to understand scientific revolutions and how we move. Let's take a point that I mentioned in my talk briefly, the geocentric versus the heliocentric view of the universe. How long does it take for the heliocentric view to overcome the geocentric view? And looking at all the cultural and social factors that are trying to preserve the geocentric view in light of new evidence. And at a certain point, that paradigm, the geocentric paradigm, just can no longer be sustained. I think Dan's a lot better on this than I am. When we taught together, he used a wonderful example of, you want to recall? Why don't you just run that by? It's a very, very...
So you'll remember my first slide had a complete list of the ways of knowing faculty on it. This is why.
This is the really fun part about
This
teaching
is the
class, because
really
we
fun part,
learn
I
off
agree.
the. I'm going to mix up our categories a little bit here, but I remember Thomas Kuhn doing was saying scientific methodology has a lot of mythology about it. And one of the myths of science he was trying to check is his science says that it's gradual and a cumulative process of you just keep gaining more and more knowledge. And he says when you look at the history of science, that's not how it actually goes. It goes for a while until it reaches a certain set of contradictions. Like, everybody knew that everything rotated around the Earth for years, and you just work with that framework. And nobody thought to question it because everybody knew that was the obvious thing. Things circle around the Earth. And then a Copernicus comes along or someone and says, well, it doesn't fit the data I'm finding. And at a certain point, then that worldview gets tossed out. The one that Ron and I use a lot in class, because my background's in geology, is plate tectonics. And for most of the history of geology, everybody knew that continents couldn't move. That would violate the laws of physics. There was no ways to get continents to move with respect to each other on the face of the Earth. And everybody knew that because the physics said it couldn't happen. But particularly coming out of World War II and the mapping of the ocean floors, we just kept getting more and more data that said, well, even though we know they can't move, they moved. And they're moving. And so we had to, it led to a completely different framework. And so it wasn't just gradual accumulation. We moved from point A to point B to point C, and then end up at point D. It was we moved to point A, B, and C, and then C got us to nonsense. And so we moved into a different alphabet to ways to frame it. And then that's now the plate tectonics. Now everybody in geology accepts the fact that the plates are moving. But that's a completely different framework than we had before. And so it's like, as Ron was saying, a scientific revolution. They have a new paradigm on that.
Yeah, and so part of
I just want to add one thing. You described it when you were a student in geology, where the older faculty were maintaining the traditional view, and the younger faculty were maintaining the new view. So there you had the clash of scientific paradigms within a specific generation, which is really fascinating.
anything else?
Yeah.
I have a question. How do your students know what's going on? I mean, what point do you start at? I mean, who comes on first? Do you come on first, or the other two, or the other three? Or how do we get it going in their minds that this is what there's ways of knowing are going on in here?
So we all teach everything, which is sort of the unique part of this class. And so we always work in pairs. And so I gave a lecture earlier on Isaac and Abraham. I lecture on the book of Job. I did Buddhism. I'll do Marx at the end. Actually, Phil Fandozzi and I had a hell of a good time because we essentially played bad cop and good cop with the book of Job, and it was excellent. So we start from the beginning, and we are, as a faculty, it's me the entire semester, so I don't pop in the middle with this lecture. So the class is designed so they have interaction with with essentially two people each semester, and we play to our strengths, but we're both always there.
Any more questions? Oh, yes, one more, Pat.
On one of your earlier slides on the legal definition of science, it was alluded to the natural law, a couple different places in that definition. And what do you mean by that?
So that was Overton's phrasing. I didn't alter that. What he meant was that our explanations had to conform to things we understand to be true about nature. So if you have an explanation that completely flies in the face of the law of gravity, you're outside the realm of nature and natural laws. So that's all that means.
Anybody else? Anyone else? Okay, thanks a million, Paul.
Thanks.